Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newseum's Night TV studio and another edition of Inside Media. I'm your host, John Maynard. Well, it was nearly a year ago that our guest, Juan Williams, was unceremoniously dismissed from his job at National Public Radio for remarks he made on Fox News Channel on the O'Reilly Factor in October 2010. Williams told the host, Bill O'Reilly, that he gets nervous when boarding airplanes with passengers dressed in Muslim garb. His very public firing was followed by a torrent of media coverage and sparked nationwide outrage. Juan has chronicled events leading up to, including and following the incident in the new book, Muzzled: The Assault on Honest Debate. But beyond telling his side of the story about the NPR firing, the book also explores the history of freedom of speech in this country and looks at the countless ways in which honest debate is stifled today. Juan serves as political analyst for Fox News and is a regular panelist on Fox News Sunday. He also appears regularly on Special Report with Bret Baier and as a regular substitute host for the O'Reilly Factor. In addition to his more than 10-year career with NPR, Williams spent 21 years at The Washington Post as an editorial writer, op-ed columnist, and White House reporter. He is also the author of the acclaimed biography, Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary, and the bestsellers Enough and Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, 1954 to 1965. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Juan Williams. Thank you, Juan, we'll get to the book in just a second, but I need to talk a little politics with you first.
Sure. Everybody likes to talk politics.
There you go. There you go. What can we make of the results yesterday with the Florida straw poll?
It's something like none of the above.
Okay.
You know, the idea that Herman Cain wins the Florida straw poll is a surprise to me, but it's a surprise only in this regard. I think it was a protest vote by people who really got turned off in terms of that Republican base to Rick Perry. I think Rick Perry should have won that contest. It's a very bad sign for his prospects to have done so poorly. Mitt Romney really did not put a lot of effort into the straw poll. Both Romney and Perry flew away from Florida to Michigan yesterday and left the stage really to Herman Cain, who delivered a terrific red meat type speech that just excited the people who had a vote in the Florida straw poll. And so I think as people were turning away from Rick Perry in light of what many on the far right felt was a disappointing debate performance, their second choice was Herman Cain. And I think for people who are disenchanted with Mitt Romney, who think he's not authentic and lacking in some of the Tea Party orthodoxy, again, they just picked Herman Cain. They said, you know what, this is, as I said earlier, none of the above, a protest vote.
And Perry certainly didn't distinguish himself at the debate the Thursday night. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, remember, it's always telling, John, who's the audience? It's like, who's the judge, you know? And in this case, the judge is the base of the Republican Party. And so it's for people who are at that base to make the judgment, did he in fact do badly in the debate? Now, if you were asking, I think, people in the middle of the political spectrum, how did Rick Perry do? I'm not sure that they would have been enchanted with some of his answers about things like Social Security being a Ponzi scheme, if you recollect. But when it came to his most controversial answer in terms of the far right, which was that he said that he thought illegal immigrant children should be eligible for in-state tuition in Texas, and he said that people who didn't understand it lacked a heart, I'm sure that, one, the Hispanic community thought, oh, good. You know, if they were the judges of that debate, they wouldn't have said that he was a loser on that point. And secondly, I think given that this is the fact that program's been endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce, not only here but in Texas, again, many in the business community who want an educated workforce would not have scolded him for it. But the fact is that immigration is a polarizing issue. And for people who are on the far right, the idea is you should build offenses, you talk about things like terror babies and anchor babies, and then for Rick Perry to say that they don't have a heart, I think was insulting even.
Right. Well, let's get to the book, and let's start with the incident itself that occurred on the O'Reilly Factor during one of your regular appearances here. Let's play that clip, and then Juan will talk us through it.
So where am I going wrong there, Juan?
Well, actually, I hate to say this to you because I don't want to get your ego going, but I think you're right. I think, look, political correctness can lead to some kind of paralysis where you don't address reality. I mean, look, Bill, I'm not a bigot. You know the kind of books I've written about the civil rights movement in this country. But when I get on a plane, I got to tell you, if I see people who are in Muslim garb, and I think, you know, they're identifying themselves first and foremost as Muslims, I get worried. I get nervous. Now, I remember also that when that Times Square bomber was at court, I think this was just last week, he said the war with Muslims, America's war with, is just beginning, first drop of blood. I don't think there's any way to get away from these facts, but I think there are people who want to somehow remind us all, as President Bush did after 9/11, it's not a war against Islam. President Bush went to a
there
mosque
isn't any
to
theology
worship.
involved in this at
We'll
all.
stop it there. But give us how did that all start anyway? Because it was Bill O'Reilly had been on The View the
Sure.
day before.
So, John, the way this started was that Bill O'Reilly had been on The View, the ABC program that has 5 female hosts, and Bill was making the case about Muslims basing a mosque near Ground Zero. And the question was, why are you objecting to this? You know, would you object to a church, a synagogue, etc.? And then Bill O'Reilly, at that point, famously said, well, Muslims attacked us on 9/11. And that prompted Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar to walk off the set in protest. And it was only after Bill said, look, I'm talking here about radical Muslims. I don't know why I have to say that every time, but I'm talking about radical Muslims. Did those 2 ladies then come back? That was on a Friday afternoon. It got into the Saturday morning papers as a big brouhaha between the conservative, domineering O'Reilly and the liberal ladies of The View, you know, one of those kinds of celebrity gossip things. But as in the next show, the one that you just saw the clip from, Bill said, tell me where I went wrong. And so then I responded as I did.
Right. 11 months later, any regrets for what you said?
No, you know, John, I've never had a moment where I thought, you know, and in my business, I have moments like this where you wake up in the middle of the night, you go, oh, what a schmuck, why did I do that? I shouldn't have said that. Or you're in the shower and you think, oh, if I'd only put it this way, or if I'd put it in context. But in all honesty, I've never had that moment because, as you can see, I went on to be very clear that this is not about a war against Islam. And in fact, in the segment, and remember, this is cable TV, so it's highly charged, and you're dealing with people who are strong personalities like Bill O'Reilly, and there's lots of sound bites and firing quickly and interrupting, going back and forth. But even in that environment, I managed to get across, look, I'm a Christian, and I don't come to judgment about Christians, all Christians, based on the behavior of a Timothy McVeigh. I don't come to judgment about Christians based on the behavior of the people in the Westboro Baptist Church who engage in those rants at military funerals. So I was very clear in saying, you know what, we don't want to say the kinds of things about Muslims, even as we acknowledge there's a legitimate link between radical Islam and terrorism, but we don't want to treat Muslims in such a way as to encourage events such as that minister down in Florida who was going to burn the Koran and offend Muslims, or encourage someone like the man who thought that his cab driver was Muslim and then reached from behind and cut his throat. That's not America. I emphasize that America is based on principles of religious liberty, that we are a land of religious liberty, and even as we fight extremism and terrorism, it's important for us to maintain that tenet.
So why do you think you were fired by NPR?
Oh, well, I think a couple things. One is I think they didn't like the idea that one of their leading personalities was also a personality on Fox. And I think in the current media environment that we live in, there are people who say you're either working for liberal media or conservative media, and here I was with a foot in both. And there were some people in the NPR audience who, you know, I'd worked at NPR for 10 years, who had questioned this along the ways, but management had always consistently come back and said, well, he's not doing anything that's non-journalistic or illegitimate. You know, in fact, he's exposing the NPR brand potentially to a new audience, to people who might not know NPR. But then came the latest change in management, and the people who came in this change were more uncomfortable with it, John, and said things like, why are you writing op-eds for the New York Times and the Washington Post? You know, we want to clear what you say there. And I was uncomfortable with that. We want to know what books you plan to write. They didn't like a book that I had written about Bill Cosby, in which Bill Cosby talked about problems in the black community. and incurred some criticism for it from black leadership, and they didn't like the posture that I had taken in that book. And then they said, when you do appear on primetime shows on Fox, don't identify yourself as an NPR person, as if most people say, hey, isn't that the same guy who's on NPR? You know, I mean, I don't think there's no secret. But they didn't want me to identify myself. And then they said, you know, even in terms of the speeches you give, the public appearances you make, we want to clear everything. And I said, I'm just not comfortable with that. They said, well, if that's the case, you have a choice. You can either abide by our rules and stay on the staff, or leave the staff and we'll give you a contract. So I said, well, okay, I'll take the contract. But the minute I took the contract, John, they started cutting my salary and diminishing my role on the air.
Right. And when you say they, in terms of management, can you tell us who you're specifically talking about?
Ellen Weiss was the NPR senior VP for news, and Vivian Schiller was the president of NPR.
Okay. And both not there.
Right. Well, I mean, this story goes on
Yes.
in some unpleasant ways.
Probably another conversation.
Right.
I do want to get to some criticism of the book. When the book came out in July, former NPR ombudsman Lisa Shepard wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that, and this is her words, you were being disingenuous in calling your firing a free speech issue. She wrote that the NPR editors had been unhappy with you for a couple of years, and as she writes, it was, quote, a case of management snapping after years of warning him to be more careful. And NPR should have quietly let his contract expire rather than fire him over the phone. So she's critical of NPR also, but how would you respond to Lisa Shepard's?
I think that's basically a mouthpiece for NPR's defense of what I consider to be the indefensible. They hadn't been warning me about anything except the fact that they were uncomfortable with me expressing my views. And here's the thing. As a news analyst, and I was a news analyst for National Public Radio, the whole idea is that I will honestly tell people what I'm thinking, the basis for my opinions, what I'm learning from my reporting, from the fact that I've been around Washington now more than 30 years and have good sources. People return my phone calls. So the idea is that as opposed to what people say in front of the camera or in front of the microphone, I can help to convey some of what's going on behind the scenes, inside the closed doors. And for me to not be able to tell you, here's how I feel in a moment where I feel anxious or nervous, to me would have been disingenuous. That's what would have been a fraud in terms of the media consumer that we have in front of us this afternoon. And I would add that Alicia Shepard then went on to make the case that, wait a second, haven't you noticed Juan Williams is black? And since he's black, imagine how Juan Williams, who's written these books about civil rights, would react if a white person was walking down the street late at night and saw some young black men who were dressed in hip-hop garb, making lots of loud noise, behaving thuggishly, and that white man said, you know what, I'm afraid of those kids. I'm going to cross the street or I'm going to hit the lock on my car door. Wouldn't Juan Williams be the first to yell racism? And in fact, Juan Williams would be the first to say, hey, white man, you're pretty smart, because I'd do the same thing. I'd get out of there. And what is wrong with acknowledging that you're nervous in this situation? You're not supposed to say it immediately. And this is what, you know, I was told in the conversation in which I was fired. You know, you can't say that. You're violating journalistic standards by making a statement about being nervous in a moment. So just, John, this wasn't even a fully formed opinion. I was just revealing a feeling. This is how I feel. And so to me, it would have been disingenuous to, again, use Alicia Shepard's words, to be dishonest with the audience.
Soon after you were fired, Fox News immediately announced a substantial 3-year contract with you. Some might say it all worked out for the best and you made out well. How would you respond to that?
You know, now almost a year later, next month will be a year since October. This happened. And I've noticed a pattern, John. Men say what you just said to me. You know what? Fox gave you a bigger contract. Remember, I was working for Fox and NPR.
Sure.
But Fox gave you a bigger contract, so you're fine. Financially, you're fine. Women, on the other hand, almost uniformly come up to me and say, are you okay? Realizing that it's no fun to not only be called a bigot and to sort of, you know, have your public identity besmirched in this way. But remember that Vivian Schiller then went on very publicly, in fact, in front of TV cameras, to say anything Juan Williams says should be between him and his psychiatrist, and that whatever he says is probably being put together by a publicist, as if I'm infantile, unable to speak for myself, and I'm just mouthing words. I think a lot of this felt as if it was a very personal attack, and I tell you, it's one of these things where people see folks like me on TV or listen on the radio, read, and they say, well, he's a big boy, he can take care of himself. But that night, when this first happened, the call came at around 5 in the afternoon. I think I just kind of lost it. I don't think I was in touch with I just couldn't believe it. And I went and ate some Chinese food, and then I had to do Sean Hannity's show that night. And it was only after Sean Hannity's show that I mentioned to Sean what had happened, and I started to come into touch with my feelings. And I think the fear was, NPR is such a much-loved brand in American media. They're a major platform, microphones in every town, that they were going to have the last word on this, and that people would say, well, NPR is pretty good. I believe them. I don't believe this guy. And so I thought, well, maybe my career is over, and as I said, my good name is never going to be the same. Who's going to want to deal with someone who has been branded so publicly as a bigot?
Mm-hmm. Do you still listen to NPR?
Occasionally,
yeah.
Not much.
No,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I want to get to the substance of the book, because the first chapter really details your public firing, but then we really get into a discussion of the history of free speech. Give us your definition of political correctness, and when did it become something, in your view, that has sort of gotten out of hand in this country?
Well, I think I would go back, if you were to define political correctness as, again, speech that's intended to be racially, gender sensitive, that it's intended to defeat some of the stereotypes that existed for so long in American society, not only with regard to gender and race, but even to people who are disabled, in so many ways, to people who are imprisoned, just to try and level the playing field in terms of the way we talk about people. So much of this started in the 60s and 70s. And then, of course, there developed a backlash in which people felt somewhat constrained, and all this talk about, you can't recommend a book by a dead white man on some of these liberal campuses, so there was suddenly a conservative backlash against it. And it seemed to me like it was dying off for a while. But then what has happened is that as American politics have become more polarized, each side has taken to trying to control the conversation and control the language that defines the conversation. So people who are pro-choice or pro-life in terms of the abortion conversation. People would say that in terms of the immigration debate that we touched on just a moment ago with Rick Perry, that you're with us or against us. You either want to build walls and stop this flow and it's illegal, or you're for amnesty and you want to give amnesty to these criminals. Right. And the conversation then becomes locked in this way. Or if you're a critic of the war effort, let's say in Iraq or Afghanistan, you're with us or against us. Or aren't you committed to winning, without saying, well, wait a minute, what does winning really mean for America in these circumstances?
And so you mentioned some of these issues that, in your view, we can't really have an honest debate about. And you mentioned abortion. You actually devote a whole chapter to abortion. Is that correct? Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
And the reason I do that is because it's so illustrative of the idea that there's so much money to be made by so many of these wedge issues that, abortion actually is quite fascinating to my mind as a case study, because conservatives, Republicans, were strong advocates of family planning until 1972 in the course of the Nixon campaign, when Nixon made a strong connection with the Catholic Church audience, which was a Democratic base audience, and said, wait a second, we stand for life and we'll stand against abortion, which pleased the Catholic Church hierarchy, but it also then, not only in terms of delivering votes, brought in terrific money to the Republican side of the vote. And ever since, Republicans have used that issue successfully. And now Democrats, mimicking it and again locking in the debate, have found that by talking about being pro-choice and saying, these people are going to force us back to back alley abortions and the like, they too have found they can energize their base and bring in tons of money through direct mail with the use of their efforts on abortion in support of abortion rights in the country. But again, real discussion, honest discussion about what abortion represents in American life, what would happen if the court ever ruled it illegal. You never hear these conversations. It's always, and I might add that what further complicates it is there are people who will say if you're a God-fearing person, how can you be for abortion, or how can you be against abortion? All of a sudden, the idea that America is a country that is not guided by any one religion, that we're non-sectarian, is lost in the midst of a debate in which if you can be condemned as a bad Christian for disagreeing with somebody.
We do want to hear from our audience. We do have two staffers with microphones on either side, so please just raise your hand and the staffer will come to you. While you're thinking of a question, please, you have a chapter in the book, Juan, called The Provocateurs. Tell us who are some of these provocateurs, some of the worst offenders perhaps, and what's their influence?
Oh, well, I think their influence is tremendous. I mean, I would guess Rush Limbaugh would be a terrific example of the most successful provocateur that we have working in American media today. He is so funny and so delightfully entertaining. Sometimes you can forget it, but I mean, Rush says some really outrageous things. And he says, you know, you don't need to listen to anybody. Basically, it's his voice and his voice alone on the show. But he says things like, you know, he wants the president to fail. And I understand that he's no fan of the president, and he certainly is a conservative. But to say that you want the president to fail, is the president of the United States, and even if you disagree with his policies, you would want him to succeed to the point that our country would do well. You wouldn't, and so it's hard to have a conversation with someone when they say, oh, I want the president to fail. When people said that they thought President Bush had misled the country about weapons of mass destruction, he would defend President Bush and say, well, maybe he received bad guidance. He was, you know, his aides did a bad job in terms of intelligence collection and the like. But it wasn't the case that you want there to be no weapons of mass destruction so as to embarrass. I mean, if somebody had said that, he would be outraged. But he feels free to say that. And I think it creates lots of attention. In fact, you know, just the other day at the Republican debate, which was broadcast by Fox, Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico, provoked laughter when he said that this the stimulus plan produced fewer shovel-ready works than his neighbor's two dogs. Right. And then it was later understood that, in fact, he had gotten that line from Rush Limbaugh. Right. So Rush comes up with these hilarious lines, but they are intended, I think, to really demonize his opponents in many ways. And it has the effect of shutting down conversation. And rather than let you think it's just about Rush, but it's not. But there are so many people who want to be like Rush wannabes, as I think of it, because Rush, I think he makes $400 million a year. He's broadcast nationally. So talk show hosts and people who run talk shows see him as the model for success in this era. Liberals, therefore, say, oh my gosh, I can't stand Limbaugh, can't believe he's this successful. They think that all talk radio, which is dominated by conservatives, is a clear distortion in terms of the media. But if you ask liberals, if you ask conservatives, I should say, conservatives would say, oh, look at Hollywood. Look at all the movies that come out of Hollywood with all their liberal biases and you know, liberal attitudes towards everything from homosexuality to drug use to cigarette smoking and disdain for people who go to church regularly. So everybody has their side in this fight. But it's one in which, to my mind, there exists a tremendous danger for us as a media serving a democracy in service to the words that are on the outside of this building, your First Amendment. And that danger is that we as an American people no longer get to hear the stories of other Americans, that we simply hear from people who agree with us, who share our opinions. So people of like mind, like point of view, are able to tune into programs that reaffirm pre-existing points of view, rather than say, huh, that was interesting, that made me think, I didn't know that was going on. For you and me, John, it would be as if we heard a story about a poor black kid who lived, let's say, in Anacostia here in Washington, that doesn't even know what the museum is, would be intimidated at the sight of the building. And we heard about his life and his struggles in terms of getting an education. Or for that kid to hear about us and to understand the competition that exists in American media or to make a museum a success. He might not be aware, hey, wait a second, those people have insecurities, needs, and they're struggling too. I mean, so that has always served us well. I think of Walter Cronkite. When I was growing up, I didn't think of Mr. Cronkite as black, white, liberal, conservative. I just thought, boy, he's a good journalist. He seems extremely credible and trustworthy. And I think today, Walter Cronkite would not be a success in American media because we have gone from broadcast to narrowcast. And people would say, in terms of narrowcasting, is he a liberal or a conservative? Oh, he's white. Oh, he's older. And they would want him to put his opinions at the top of the news rather than the facts of the news.
Again, if there's any questions, please just plus raise your hand. Oh, we got one right in the middle row up there. Okay. If you could bring that mic up so we can hear him. Thank you. Great.
I just have one question I've been burning to ask somebody who might know. Does somebody like Rush Limbaugh, does he understand that it's nonsense? Or I mean, does he pander into? Can the man tell the difference between reality and the fantasy he seems to live in on the radio? Is he two different people? Is he doing his job and then he signs off and then he becomes like Rush Limbaugh, a real person, or is he like in Fantasyland all the time?
Well, that's, it's a prejudicial question. I'll say that.
Okay.
I can tell how you feel about Mr. Limbaugh, but I know Rush Limbaugh and find him very able to have a smart conversation. But he is a real conservative. Now, the humor, the character, I mean, the voices that mock people, he's not doing that all the time. I mean, no. I mean, he creates a fantasy world that, in fact, entrances his listeners. I mean, as I said, he's quite a funny guy and a great entertainer. And I think sometimes that quotient or that element to the programming is dismissed, especially by his critics. But no, in person, he is a very strong conservative, no question about it.
But does he really believe that so-and-so individual really does, for example, eat babies for breakfast? I mean,
I would hope not. I don't know.
wonder sometimes.
Yeah, well,
He does such a good job.
he does a great job. But again, here's the question I sometimes get, which is a compliment to your question. It's not, does Limbaugh believe this stuff? It's, does his audience believe this stuff? And that's the scarier part to me, is if any audience was saying, oh yeah, that's the most credible and sole source of news that I need to know what's going on in America.
Oh, we have a question right there. Great.
So I think it's interesting. I agree with you largely about the sort of notion that the media discourse has become this kind of polarizing echo chamber. So I guess my question to you would be sort of a reflexive one, and that is, if you're on Fox News or the other side, do you feel like you're sort of buying into that by participating and feeding it more and more? And I guess whether it's a yes or no answer, do you have any other options?
Oh, sure. Here's the answer. I feel as if by participating on Fox, in fact, I'm often a foil for their large personalities and very strong conservatives like Sean Hannity, that it's really important to engage people and to say, hey, I have a different point of view. I don't see it the way you see it. And I think it's to Fox's credit that nobody's telling me what to say. You can't say that, or you're not going to be on if you take a more liberal point of view. Now, this is so curious in my existence, because if I ask liberals, when liberals are asked about me, they say he's a conservative, right? But when conservatives are asked about me, they say he's a liberal, that son of a gun, right? So it's one of those things. But in comparison to Sean Hannity, I look like I'm far left, right? But that's in comparison. But I'm there challenging him and saying, hey, there are facts that you are missing, and you're just engaged in Obama bashing or whatever. And guess what? The Fox audience values it. They want to know the other side. Certainly, they're attracted to Sean Hannity. He's the star. It's his show. His name is on the marquee. But they want a sense of exactly what's the other side up to and give us some insight. And I'm able to bring that to the table. Remember, Fox and NPR, left and right, were paying me simultaneously for 10 years. So I was bringing value to either audience as a result. So you ask, do I support, am I giving support to that kind of polarization by being a personality on Fox? And in fact, I think I'm doing my journalism, and I've never varied. It's not like I feel I have to change my point of view to pander to a conservative audience because I appear on Fox News. Not at all.
Question right there, sir.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So I had a neighbor a couple of years ago who comes up to me and says, you know, they're going to start taxing dog farts now. People are going to have to pay extra whenever they have a dog because the farts that your dog, sorry, I know we're on and this all went back to something that was heard on a program that had the word news in it that referred to a suggestion by Al Gore for a cap and trade kind of approach where farmers who had large herd of cattle and produced methane gas, that would get taxed as contributing to
Greenhouse
global warming.
gases.
And so my neighbor took it down to the level of his dog, which was what he had heard on the news. So my question is, where do we go from here? I mean, you know,
Well, it's hard to go lower.
Because it seems to me we've gotten to a point where programs that have the word news in them, and I would say even networks, but programs that have the word news in them have a bias and have a political stance. And news by definition is political, you know, but how do we move beyond that where we have somebody that we can trust to be telling us something that is closer to a fair and unbiased report? Because at the moment, I think I used to think it was NPR, but NPR has its own business, as you know, have told us.
Well, no, this is good news to me, to my mind as a journalist, to hear this question asked. And I must tell you, the last person I heard it from was Jon Stewart. I was on Jon Stewart's show, and he said much the same thing. He said, you know, you look at what sells in terms of American media, and it tends to be these niche programs that present the strong political point of views. And I would add personality-driven programming or infotainment that's really about celebrities. And you know, remember on these personality shows, they're selecting the stories that they want to focus on for that day, and typically they help to support one political point of view or another. So MSNBC, Fox, CNN, I could go on. The radio shows, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the New York Times editorial page. You know, sometimes you think they are very alternate universes. But increasingly, the audiences that have sustained and I think created that marketplace are starting to ask the question that you've asked this afternoon, which is, you know, I'd like to have a show, a program, a publication that I can trust, that I can say these folks are really trying to tell me what's going on to the best of their ability. And I think that must be then the start, the germination of the next generation. In the way that, having mentioned Jon Stewart, I think bringing humor to the news has worked so well with Comedy Central, not only for Stewart, but for Stephen Colbert, and of course the nighttime entertainers, Leno and Letterman, they do it at the top of their shows. I could go on. That's an industry now in and of itself. But it may be in the way that the Poynter Institute does PolitiFact, in the way that you do now more and more fact-checking after debates to see exactly who told the truth and who didn't. I think that people are saying, you know, I have a busy life, I have my own life, I can't follow the news intimately every moment of every day. And rather than saying, well, therefore I'm going to trust a big personality who's on my political side, they may be looking for programming that they feel has a higher level of credibility. And the question is, how do we make that programming attractive? How do we make it sexy, fun, and at the same time highly credible without appealing and saying, we're just going after the base on the right or the left?
We've almost run out of time, but I did want to get one last question into you about NPR and Fox News. What was the newsroom culture like? You know, you worked at both places for so long. What was it like in the Fox News Channel newsroom as opposed to the NPR newsroom?
Well, it's, you know, a danger for me is, you know, I've worked there so long that I just become accustomed to it. I think, remember, one's a cable channel, so you have these large personalities around all the time, and it's very ratings driven. I mean, very sensitive to, are we succeeding? NPR is a different kind of environment in the sense that there aren't any large personalities. Oftentimes people struggle to tell me who hosts any of the shows. And the emphasis on debate and sharp contrast and things that are even funny exist at Fox because, again, it's part of a TV, primetime cable. I mean, that's what it is. It doesn't exist, that sense of humor, that dollop of sarcasm and all that, and you just don't get that sense. And then the other thing is that I think for many of the people at NPR, in terms of pursuing the journalism, the whole emphasis there is on actuality when possible. You notice that in cable TV, there's a clear emphasis on debate. It's almost like radio brought to TV in terms of the conversation, but not in terms of the actuality of the tape of this is happening now. There's not that clear emphasis.
Well, we have run out of time. I want to thank our guest, Juan Williams. And again, his book, Muzzled, The Assault on Honest Debate. You can have copies signed right outside the studio, and you can buy a copy out there also. So thank you, sir.
John, thank
Appreciate
you for
it.
having me. Thank you very much.